Thank you, and welcome to the fourth part of our present series on the dispensations of God. We're studying the very dispensations of the Scriptures. As of last time, we have studied the first three dispensations. The fourth dispensation is also given two names, and these names are the Dispensation of Promise or the Dispensation of Patriarchal Rule. This covers the period of time from Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, all the way till Exodus chapter 18, verse 27. As I mentioned, our study on the dispensations, each dispensation has 7 facets. The first facet concerns the key person, and in this case, the key person is Abraham. Abraham stands as the head of this new age, and to him, new divine revelation is given, which becomes the basis of a new dispensation. Now, secondly, concerning the name of this dispensation, as I mentioned, it has 2 names. The first name is the name of promise, the dispensation of promise, which emphasizes the revelational aspect in that God was revealing himself by making specific, series, and many promises. The name for this dispensation as the dispensation of promise is a name we derive from 4 passages in the New Testament. We derive it from Romans chapter 4 verses 1 through 26, Galatians chapter 3 verses 15 through 19, Hebrews chapter 6 verses 13 through 15, and Hebrews chapter 11 verse 9. If you look at all 4 of these passages, the key thing you will notice is the emphasis on the concept of promise in relationship to Abraham. And so, one name is the dispensation of promise. The second name is called the dispensation of patriarchal rule. The second name emphasizes the governmental aspect. Remember, a dispensation deals with God's governing of his universe at a specific period of time, and God was governing his will, this dispensation, by means of his patriarchs, such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, among others. Now, the third facet concerns the responsibility. And the responsibility in this case was the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant emphasized the responsibility as being to believe the promises of God. Though they may not now be seen, yet they were to believe the promises of God. This was their responsibility. And Abraham, of course, passed this responsibility in that we are told in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, that Abraham believed God. He believed God's promises, and it was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. Now, the fourth facet concerns the test. And the test was to stay in the land. To stay in the land that God had brought them into. But then the fifth facet was failure seen in the tendency to leave the land. For example, Abraham left the land in Genesis chapter 12 and got himself to a lot of trouble. Later, Jacob also leaves the land, and he got himself into a lot of trouble. And Isaac was contemplating even leaving the land himself, in Genesis chapter 26, when God warned him against doing so. Failure was seen on the part of the Israelites because of their consistent tendency to leave the land. And even the brothers of Joseph, when they sold him, they did not sell him to someone that would make him a slave in the land, but made him a slave in Egypt instead. Ultimately, the judgment, which is the sixth facet, the judgment for failure was the Egyptian bondage, and the slavery in Egypt was the judgment for failure in this area. But then seventhly, the facet of grace was seen in the preservation of Israel, in that Israel was preserved, no matter whether they were in the land or outside the land, and God continued to preserve the seed of the woman now going through Abraham and through Isaac and through Jacob.